Hello everyone, and welcome back to DMG. With every coming generation of computer hardware, the maximum horsepower you can get from your computer increases. But often overlooked is the drop in power draw and heat output, and also size of the physical chips that each coming generation brings. And I feel like nothing better exemplifies this massive increase in efficiency than the Intel NUC, or next unit of computing, and its competitors. These tiny computers here can all do the same thing as this big guy back here, while consuming significantly less wattage, and I do mean significantly, at a fraction of the price that this would have cost new. They're absolutely tiny. And the craziest thing is, only about a decade separates these systems and this system. So today, so that we may witness this massive jump in efficiency firsthand, I'll be taking a deeper dive into all three of these little systems here. An Intel NUC, a Quantum Byte, and a Quantum Byte Plus, and seeing what makes them just as good as this. Before I actually get into the teardown though, I will say that I would place these three devices into two separate categories, and I'll tell you why. It's all down to the power rating and the cooling, all visible from the outside. These I would classify as thin clients, and this, the Intel NUC, I would classify as a mini PC. The Intel NUC is rated for 19 volts, 3.42 amps. And that multiplies out to about 65 watts, which is, if you think about it, a respectable amount of power for a tiny device. Granted, it can still be powered from a laptop charger, but that's a lot of power in something this small. Then there are these, which are rated for 12 volts at 1 amp. And, well, this is their power supply. They actually run off of this thing, which is pretty crazy. I don't know how they packed an entire computer into something that consumes about as much power as your standard consumer mechanical hard drive. And even just looking at the cooling, these have no heat pipes, fin stacks, intakes, any of that. They're all just a brick, while the Intel NUC has exhaust on the back and intake on the bottom, and it's also substantially heavier than either of these. It's actually heavier than both put together. So I have a feeling this is packing some far more powerful hardware than these two. With that said, I feel like we should disassemble the Intel NUC first, as I think it's the best example of how a mini PC should be. I think it should just be these 4 screws on the bottom. Oh wow, that is a thick thermal pad. So we've got a big thermal pad on the back here, and then perhaps that is just passive ventilation and not an intake for a fan, because there's not a fan on the bottom. We do, however, have upgradable RAM, and what are you? You are 4 gigs of DDR3 1333, that is PC3 10600. Those just slip in here. Here we have a Plextor SSD. This is it's not an NVMe, this is an mSATA. Now this was before the dawn of NVMEs. This is from 2014, so it's a decade old. So I bet the modern ones use an NVMe, but this was basically the NVMe of the day. We also have these headers in here, and I think that is like a regular audio header. So I have a feeling that you could buy this with an optional headphone jack that you could hook up here. So that's pretty interesting. So what is that for? Oh, I bet there was a model of these with an internal power supply. Now there are two things that are good with an external power supply versus internal. Now it keeps weight and size down because all of your power circuitry can be in here instead of in there. And there's another added benefit. It keeps costs down for the manufacturer additionally because this doesn't have to be UL certified, which, you have to pay for a certification. Only the external power supply manufacturer has to pay for that UL certification. So it's a lot cheaper for a device manufacturer to just build the computer and then source a power supply from another company than to put the power supply inside the computer to start with. Now it looks like we just have some small screws that will come out here, and that should be it. I'll take out our SSD here. Oh, that's actually not a bad little Wi-Fi card. That's a Centrino Advanced In. Those are always nice to see when you're working on a device. You're like, ooh, I like that Wi-Fi card. Oh, that's so funny. This is actually an Intel desktop board. It's silk screened on the motherboard that this is an Intel desktop board SKU, I suppose. So we do indeed have a fan in this thing and a little bitty heatsink. There's our CMOS battery. I have a feeling the chipset will be under the fan and the CPU will be under the heatsink. Putting the chipset under the fan is a good way to still give it ventilation, but not, actually put a heatsink on it. And yeah, I think that might be the chipset, although these tiny CPUs are often so small that they look like chipsets. Now I will be so happy if I see a CPU socket under here. You do not even understand how elated I will be if there is a upgradable CPU in this tiny device. What is holding you on? I don't know. Oh, there's another one in the middle. I have a feeling the CPU will be soldered. Yep. Oh, that's actually a big chip though. Not a big chip as I said, but compared to the CPUs we'll probably see in these other devices, that's a respectable chip. So I'll begin screwing this little guy back together while I talk more about the dawn of the tiny computer. So as you can see, this is basically a laptop stuffed into this tiny little box, and it's a form factor that works great for a lot of people. If you want a desktop, and I will define desktop as a stationary computer that you can't just easily pick up. It doesn't have a screen or a keyboard attached to it. If you need the processing power of a laptop, but you want a computer that doesn't move and maybe has its own keyboard instead of a laptop, or its own screen instead of a laptop, this is definitely a good choice for most people, and I have no problem recommending these Intel NUC systems. However, unfortunately, this is about as upgradable as these little guys get, and you will definitely see that later on when we take a look at the other two systems, because they're about as far from upgradable as a computer can get, and that's the main trade-off that you have to pay when you switch from a big form factor like a mid-tower or full tower case to something that fits in my pocket like this nut here. However, all the important stuff, I'd argue, in these is upgradable. Most people will not need to upgrade their CPU. The Wi-Fi card is upgradable, so if you need if you bought a new router and this card doesn't support it, you could put a new one in. And the storage is upgradable, and so is your RAM. So that'll keep this machine running for a while. Now, no expansion slots, and I have mixed feelings about that. For an advanced user like me, I love having expansion slots, but I also have to acknowledge that the need for expansion slots has decreased in just the regular consumer market. Since the dawn of the ISA slot, I feel like that need has just gradually decreased. And that's because what once had to be done with an ISA or PCI card can now be done with a USB dongle. Adding storage, flash drive. Adding like a network or Bluetooth, USB dongle. It's so much easier to add like expansion options to a PC nowadays. And considering PCs already have so much on board, there isn't much that needs to be added. There isn't much that would benefit you to add to this system. So I feel like the lack of any expansion slots isn't that bad, considering the system's market. Now, its airflow isn't that great. The fan's on the top, there are no vents on the top, so it has to draw air like that, and not the best airflow pattern I've seen, but definitely not the worst. So anyway, sorry, I'm done rambling. I'll screw the system back together. Now onto the Quantum Byte. Now, I've actually disassembled one of these in the past on the channel, but, you know, that was years ago, and I feel like it's due for another analysis in this video. Now, these are very easy to get apart, but they don't need to be gotten apart because there's literally nothing you can do in here. None of this is upgradable or swappable at all. They do this odd thing where they put the CPU, RAM, and SSD on this card that slots into a DDR3 slot. But all that slot does is it interfaces with the I/O. Your main controller and all of that isn't on this board. It's on here. And that's evident because the CMOS battery doesn't plug into this I/O board. It actually plugs in to the CPU board. There's your chipset here. There's your RAM, there's your RAM, there's your SSD, there's your CPU, and that's it. There's nothing else you can do here. Even your network controller is actually on this board. So I guess that's one important thing that's on the big board here. So yeah, I actually don't know why they did this. I think it would have been so much easier to just put everything on this one board. I don't think you can just go out and buy a replacement one of these cards. But yeah, that has an Intel Atom CPU, very efficient little chip, and it has some small storage chips on there as well, and 2 gigabytes of RAM. So yes, these are pretty underpowered. Now let's look at the Byte Plus. Now, I've never worked on one of these. This is a pretty heavy little device. My impression of these is already not good since the school IT department has like 8 of these and none of them work. All of the ones in the closet are dead. So I have a feeling I'm authorized to do this. Now, I've felt around on the bottom and I don't feel any screws, but it does feel like there is a gap here. So I have a little suspicion that the screw is under this label. So if I can just get the label off. Yeah, I've been at this for like 3 minutes and I have no clue how to even get inside this thing. So yeah, I've been defeated. So this is obviously the least repairable. Let's talk about I/O really quickly. I was hopeful that this one would work because it actually has USB 3, but other than that, it's the exact same as this one. It's got USB, LAN, HDMI, which is called MON for some reason. And then of course VGA, good old VGA, and on the Intel NUC, it just has HDMI, Ethernet, 2 USB ports. I think they're USB 3 from the speed of them. Yes, this actually does work, and I've been using it. It's very nice. It has a 1.8 gigahertz 3rd generation Core i3 I hooked it up, tested it, and it's a dual-core, hyper-threaded Core i3 in here, and it's actually quite a fast, tiny chip. So these are definitely in different performance classes, as you can see by just the size of the CPU. But anyway, that is going to wrap it up for our triple teardown of these tiny little devices. Thank you everyone for watching, hope you enjoyed, and hope to see you next video.